Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we turn our gaze not to the shadows of Times Square nor the highways of California, but to the quiet streets of suburban Chicago in the mid-1970s. Elk Grove Village, to be exact. Here, in this upper-class neighborhood, people worried about little more than clean gutters before the weather turned, manicured lawns that stood out among many, and backyard parties friends wrote home about, rows of tidy homes, freshly pruned roses, a place where children played after school, neighbors waved from porches, and the silence of night was broken only by the soft hum of televisions behind closed doors. It was the kind of place where nothing truly bad was ever supposed to happen. But then it did. So come, draw a little closer to the firelight. Walk with me down one oak-lined street to 55 Brantwood Avenue in May of 1976, where that illusion of exclusivity cracked wide open. To outsiders, Patricia Columbo seemed ordinary, a teenager navigating the rough waters of growing up. But beneath the surface, her story was already veering into dangerous currents. She was just 19 years old, restless, eager to escape the boundaries her family set around her. Her parents, Frank and Mary, like most, were protective, traditional. They believed in rules, curfews, and order. Patricia Columbo, on the other hand, believed in none of it. From her mid-teens, she had begun pushing against their authority, small rebellions at first, then more serious. And by the time she turned 18, she had stepped fully into a life her parents never imagined for their daughter. For Patricia had fallen into an affair with a man far older than herself. His name was Frank DeLuca, a married man in his late 30s. To Patricia, he was not just a lover, but a partner in escape. A way out from the home she resented, from the rules she despised. Their relationship was volatile, obsessive, steeped in sex and control. And Patricia's parents wanted it ended. They disapproved. They confronted her. They tried to rein her back. But the more they pushed, the more she resisted. By 1976, the divide between Patricia and her family was a chasm. To those who knew her, Patricia's charm could be disarming. She was beautiful, flirtatious, often described as magnetic. But behind the smile, there was something darker, a need for independence so consuming that it grew into hatred. She began to imagine a future free from her parents, free from her younger brother Michael, free from all the barriers she believed stood between her and the life she wanted with DeLuca. And in Patricia's mind, there was only one way to achieve it. She believed she would inherit, that with her parents and brother gone, she would step into their wealth, their house, their resources. It was a fantasy of freedom, a twisted vision of life without boundaries, pre-made, pre-funded, and, well, pretended, because what Patricia didn't know, couldn't know, was that her parents had already disinherited her, removed her from their will entirely, aware of the storm brewing within their daughter. Patricia believed a fortune waited just beyond the wall of her family's lives, and with DeLuca by her side, she began to plan. First came whispers of hiring others, attempts to enlist hitmen to do what she could not. But when that failed, she resolved to do it herself. And so, in the spring of 1976, a 19-year-old girl, fueled by obsession, by greed, and by rebellion, set her sights not on her future, but on the destruction of her own family. The suburbs whispered of safety. Patricia whispered of murder. And soon, that pretty house on Brantwood would fall silent, in the most terrible of ways. The night of May 4th began like any other in Elk Grove Village. Lights were turned low in tidy houses, television set to hum out favorite programs, and children put to bed surrounded by the familiar. And the Columbo home was no exception to that rule. However, this particular evening would not stay that course. What Frank and Mary, nor Michael for that matter, did not know was that Patricia, who had been there earlier that day, had unlocked the back door, leaving a path for herself and her lover to return later that night and disrupt that comfortable course forever. And so they did. When the couple entered, the house was quiet, but the quiet did not last. Frank Columbo, husband, father, proud provider, was the first to confront the danger. He was ambushed in the living room. Startled, he fled for the staircase, scrambling upward in desperate hope of escape. But the shots rang out behind him. Frank DeLuca raised the gun and fired. A bullet caught Frank in the back as he climbed. He staggered, knowing it was his own daughter behind him, knowing betrayal had come wearing his own child's face. He fell against the steps, badly wounded. That is when Patricia herself stepped forward. In her hands, she held the heavy weight of a bowling trophy, once a symbol of family pastime, now an instrument of desecration. She brought it down upon her father's skull, blow after blow, until the gleaming prize shattered and fragments of brass and bone mingled on the staircase. The house groaned with violence. Mary Columbo most likely heard. She sought refuge in the place she had once made her own, the upstairs bathroom. It was her favorite room, a little sanctuary where she had lovingly painted each tile by hand, tracing them with delicate strokes of gold filigree. But the gilded patterns offered no safety now. She was cornered, cowering, clinging to the last fragments of life. When her daughter entered and looked right at her, the shot struck her clean between the eyes. She collapsed upon the floor she had once adorned with care. And still, to be certain, my stars, her throat was slit, though the medical examiner would later say the bullet had ended her life before she even touched the ground. Her daughter was not satisfied until her mother's blood stained the tiles she had once painted for beauty. And then, Lord have mercy, came Michael, 13 years old, still half a child, still in the safe dream of sleep as the first shots tore through his home. He did not wake until Patricia and DeLuca entered his room. DeLuca raised the gun and fired. Michael crumpled, but Patricia was not finished. She drug his small body from the bed to the floor. In her hands, she now carried her mother's sewing scissors. She stabbed him, once, twice, and then again and again, until the count reached 87 wounds. So many that when police found his body days later, they thought he was covered in measles. Only upon closer look did they realize the red spots were not illness, but dozens upon dozens of punctures, each one a mark of his sister's rage. A father shot and bludgeoned, a mother cornered and executed, a brother carved apart by scissors. The slaughter may have ended, but the desecration did not. Patricia and DeLuca turned on the furnace, cranked the thermostat to 97 degrees. They meant to speed decay, to ensure that when the family was found, the evidence would be clouded by time and rot. They tried to turn the home itself into an accomplice, baking the silence, burning away the truth. And then they left. DeLuca went on to work his shift at a Walgreens in the Elk Grove Village strip mall the next morning, handing out medicine as though nothing had happened. Patricia smiled in public, the mask of innocence firmly in place. For 3 long days, the house at 55 Brantwood Avenue lay heavy with its secret. The curtains stayed drawn, newspapers gathered on the porch, their headlines unread. The front door sat ajar, a subtle crack in the veneer of a home once immaculate, its lawn trimmed to perfection, its roses pruned with pride. What had always been a picture of order now whispered of disorder, if only someone had stopped to listen. Inside, the furnace hummed, pushing heat into every corner, raising the air to a suffocating 97 degrees. The killers had set it that way, hoping the heat would hasten decomposition, blurring the evidence, erasing the marks of their rage. But the heat did not erase. It magnified. The Columbo home became less a dwelling and more a tomb, sealed in silence, baking in death. And all the while, life outside went on. Children still pedaled bicycles down the oak-lined street. Neighbours trimmed their hedges. The hum of televisions carried out into the evening air. No one suspected that just across the lawn, a father lay sprawled across his staircase. A mother lay bleeding on the tiles she had once painted by hand, and a boy lay butchered in the room where he had once dreamed of tomorrow. Patricia and Frank DeLuca walked freely in those days. In fact, the very morning after the slaughter, DeLuca reported to work as usual. At the Walgreens in Elk Grove Village's Go-Go Center strip mall, he filled prescriptions, greeted customers, moved through the motions of ordinary life as though his hands had not just held a gun, as though his eyes had not just watched a family collapse in terror. Patricia too kept her mask fixed. For 8 days after the murders, she roamed free, a 19-year-old woman whose painted lips and heavy eyeliner seemed almost to mock the grief she should have worn. When police finally summoned her to the station to inform her of her family's deaths, detectives were stunned. Instead of rushing to the scene, overcome with sorrow, Patricia arrived in what one officer later described as a Fredericks of Hollywood get-up. Flashy, provocative, caked in makeup, she looked less like a grieving daughter and more like someone heading to a performance. And perform she did. When told her family had been massacred, she did not collapse, she did not weep. She began instead to offer theories. She spoke of her father's supposed ties to the mob, suggesting he ran a chop shop for stolen cars behind the auto parts store he managed. She pointed investigators toward shadows that did not exist, toward gangland hits and organized crime. But detectives were not fooled. They knew Frank Columbo was no mobster. He was an honest, hard-working man, devoted to his family, weary from his battles with his strong-willed daughter. He had no hidden ties, no secret debts. Patricia's stories rang false, her demeanor too composed, too performative. The officers smelled deceit, and with each passing word, suspicion coiled more tightly around her. The discovery itself came on May 7th. A patrolman arrived to inform Frank that one of the family cars had been found abandoned on Chicago's west side. A poor neighborhood chosen deliberately by Patricia and DeLuca to stage the murders as the work of street gangs. But the officer noticed the signs. The front door ajar, the newspapers piled untouched. His instincts drew him inside. And there, at the foot of the stairs, silence broke. Frank lay sprawled across the steps, his body frozen in the moment of his desperate flight. A jagged piece of the bowling trophy protruded from his skull. The officer froze, then radioed for backup, his voice unsteady as he described what lay before him. Upstairs, Mary was found in her sanctuary bathroom. The room she had once adorned with filigree, now marked by the dark stain of her own blood. And nearby, Michael, small, fragile, riddled with wounds that at first looked like a rash, until detectives realized each red dot was a puncture made by his sister's hand. The house was silent no longer. It screamed with betrayal. And as the news spread through Elk Grove Village, the picture of safety cracked wide open. For in this quiet suburb, behind this perfect lawn, it was not outsiders who had brought death. It was not gangsters. It was not thieves. It was a daughter. And the mask Patricia wore would soon begin to slip. Truth is, had anyone looked closer, earlier, she'd never really had it on straight in the first place. The funeral for Frank, Mary and young Michael Columbo should have been a somber affair. Black clothing, quiet tears, a community gathered in mourning. And yet all eyes soon found their way to Patricia. She was 19 years old, fresh-faced and striking, but instead of grief, she seemed amused. Witnesses later recalled her laughing, whispering, even flirting with young men in attendance. Where others stood in silence, Patty twirled her hair, smiled, and carried herself with a lightness that clashed violently with the 3 coffins laid before her. To detectives, her performance at the funeral confirmed what they had already begun to suspect. Patricia was no grieving daughter. She was something else entirely. In the days following the murders, investigators had already noted oddities in her behavior. When police questioned her, she remained calm. Too calm. She spoke as though the deaths were an inconvenience, not a tragedy. She asked casual questions, her tone eerily detached. For officers seasoned in grief's many forms, her lack of sorrow set alarm bells ringing. But strangeness alone does not prove guilt. Evidence was needed. And in Patricia's past, investigators soon uncovered a trail that pointed directly toward her. Months before the killings, Patricia had made attempts to hire others to do the work for her. She had approached men, whispered offers of money if they would rid her of her parents. Each plan had crumbled. No one followed through. But the attempts revealed her intent. She had been plotting this annihilation long before it happened. When the murders finally came, she had enlisted not strangers, but her lover. Frank DeLuca, nearly 40 years old, married, a man enthralled by Patricia's beauty and wildness, had joined her in the slaughter. Together, they were bound not only by sex and secrecy, but by blood spilled across a family home. Investigators pieced the story together quickly. The staged car, the untouched valuables, the thermostat cranked high. Each detail pointed away from random intruders and towards someone inside the family circle. Someone who stood to gain. And Patricia had motive. She believed inheritance lay waiting. The Columbo home, their assets, their wealth. All of it, she thought, would pass to her once her parents and brother were gone. What she did not know was that her parents, long aware of her instability and rebellion, had already locked that door and threw away the key. She killed for an inheritance she was never going to receive. Her mask cracked further in the days after the funeral. Neighbors noted how quickly she returned to her routines, how easily she smiled. At the police station, detectives watched as she flirted with officers, her eyes bright, her body language playful. It was behavior so jarring, so unnatural for a girl who had just buried her family. Her entire family, mind you, that it became impossible to ignore. And soon, the testimony of those she had approached months earlier, her failed attempts to hire killers, sealed the suspicion. Here was a girl who had dreamed of parricide long before the night it came true. The net tightened. Patricia and Frank DeLuca were arrested, charged with the murders of Frank, Mary, and Michael Columbo. In custody, the mask she had worn for so long finally began to slip completely. The flirtatious smiles, the calm tones, they no longer held power. What remained was a young woman who had orchestrated the slaughter of her own bloodline for nothing more than fantasy and greed. A daughter without grief, a lover without conscience, a mask that had cracked, revealing the true horror beneath. In 1977, the trial of Patricia Columbo and Frank DeLuca began. The courthouse filled with the hum of voices, reporters crowding the steps, neighbors whispering about the girl who had once walked their quiet streets. The murders had already stained Elk Grove Village with infamy, but now the nation turned its gaze to the young woman accused of orchestrating her family's annihilation. Patricia was 19, still young enough to appear innocent, still striking enough to draw eyes. But innocence was shattered the moment the prosecution opened their case. The evidence was laid out with precision. Photographs of the crime scene, blood-soaked carpets, the brutalized bodies of Frank and Mary Columbo, and most shocking of all, the wounds inflicted upon 13-year-old Michael. Nearly 100 stab wounds, his body ravaged by scissors and bludgeoned with a bowling trophy. It was not just murder, it was overkill, rage carried to its ugliest end. The prosecution painted Patricia as the architect, a manipulator who wrapped DeLuca around her finger, feeding him promises and using his devotion as a weapon. They told the jury about her failed attempts to hire hitmen, her obsession with inheritance, her hatred for the rules her parents set. They described how she turned the thermostat up, staged the family car, and carried herself with eerie calm in the days after the slaughter. And they told of her demeanor at the funeral, the laughter, the flirting, as though grief were a costume she had chosen not to wear. For the jury, it was a portrait of a daughter without conscience. The defense, meanwhile, scrambled for foothold. They pointed to DeLuca, suggesting that he was the one who wielded the most violence, that Patricia was manipulated, not manipulator. They spoke of her youth, her naivety, her troubled relationship with her parents, but their arguments paled in the face of the brutality. Witnesses testified about Patricia's earlier solicitations, her attempts to hire others to kill her family. These voices carried weight, showing that the murders were not a sudden explosion of rage, but a carefully plotted plan. As the days unfolded, the evidence grew insurmountable. The jury was shown not just crime scene photos, but the psychology of the killers. They were asked to look at a 19-year-old girl and see not immaturity, but monstrosity. So they did. And they did. When the verdict was read, the silence in the courtroom was heavy, suffocating. Guilty. Patricia Columbo and Frank DeLuca were both convicted of 3 counts of murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. The judge's sentence was extraordinary. 200 to 300 years in prison. A symbolic eternity, ensuring neither would ever walk free again. For Patricia, it meant she would spend her life behind bars. Her beauty fading, her flirtations meaningless, her inheritance nothing more than a dream turned to ash. The courtroom exhaled. Justice in the legal sense had been delivered. But justice does not heal. It does not bring Frank and Mary Columbo back to their neighbors, nor Michael back to the teenage years he never lived. It does not restore the family dinners, the laughter, the simple suburban evenings cut short by greed and rage. Patricia and DeLuca were led from the courtroom in shackles, their partnership sealed, not in love, but in blood. They had entered together, and they would spend their lives bound by the consequences of their crime. For the people of Elk Grove Village, the trial closed a chapter, but it did not erase the whispers. The quiet suburb, once defined by stillness and safety, now carried the weight of what had happened behind one family's door. And Patricia, once a daughter, once a sister, was now only a prisoner, her name spoken not with affection, but now with horror. The gavel had fallen, the sentences had been read, and Patricia Columbo was led away in chains. 19 years old when she orchestrated the annihilation of her own family, she would never again walk the quiet streets of Elk Grove Village. Her sentence, 2 to 3 centuries, was more than a punishment. It was a statement, a way of saying, you will die in prison, and so will the man who helped you. And so she did. Through the 1980s, the 1990s, and into the new century, Patricia remained behind bars. She grew older, her face no longer the alluring mask of a teenager, but the lined features of a woman aging in captivity. The beauty she once wielded like a weapon faded, leaving only the echoes of who she had been when she chose blood over family. But prison did not silence her completely. Patricia sought parole many times. At hearing after hearing, she stood before boards and argued that she had changed, that she had grown, that she no longer posed a threat. She spoke of rehabilitation, of the decades spent reflecting on her crimes. Yet each time, the families of Frank, Mary and Michael Columbo, and the prosecutors who remembered the crime scene stood in opposition. They spoke of the brutality of the murders, not simply killings, but mutilations, desecrations. They reminded the board that Michael was 13, that Patricia's parents had been shot and butchered in their own home, that her actions were not born of youth or confusion, but of calculated greed and obsession. Each time, parole was denied, and Patricia remained in her cell. Frank DeLuca, her lover and co-conspirator, also lived and died in prison, his sentence running its course as years piled upon years. Their partnership, once bound by lust and conspiracy, was reduced to separate lives lived behind iron bars. Two shadows, never again meeting in freedom. Today, Patricia Columbo is still incarcerated, still serving her centuries-long sentence. She is in her 60s now. For most of her life, the walls of prison have been her world. She will likely die within them. And yet, her story lingers, a whisper that never quite fades. It is not just the brutality that haunts us, but the contradiction. The face of a teenage girl, smiling, flirtatious, outwardly ordinary. The daughter who should have carried flowers at her family's graveside, not a weapon into their living room. The sister who should have protected Michael, not stabbed him nearly 100 times. It reminds us that danger does not always wear the face we expect. Sometimes it sits at a funeral with a laugh on its lips. And in the end, that may be the darkest truth of Patricia Columbo's story. That monsters do not always arrive from the outside. Sometimes they are born within the home itself. Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by Firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe, and before you drift off, toss a little fuel on the fire. Hit that like button, ring that bell, so when the shadows shift again, you'll be the first to know that another fire's burning and another story's being told. Until next time, rest well.